I want you to start by picturing a very specific, incredibly desolate scene.
Okay, set the stage for us.
Right. So imagine you are standing in the freezing, absolute zero cold of a forced labor camp in the middle of the Kazakh steppe.
Just brutal conditions.
Yeah, entirely brutal. You are malnourished. You are exhausted to your very bones. But more importantly, you are carrying a manuscript inside your head.
Literally just in your brain.
Exactly. We are not talking about like a short story or a simple poem here. You are holding a sprawling, highly detailed, multi-volume manuscript that you know without a single shadow of a doubt possesses the power to topple the empire that put you in this camp.
Which is just a mind-blowing amount of pressure.
It is, and the catch is that you cannot write a single word of it down. If a guard finds even a scrap of paper with unauthorized writing on it, your sentence is extended indefinitely or, you simply disappear.
Right, you're just gone.
So instead of writing, you have to memorize thousands upon thousands of words, line by painstaking line. And to keep track of where you are in this massive mental architecture, to maintain the sequence of those thousands of paragraphs, you're moving your frozen fingers over a makeshift rosary.
Rosary made out of...
A rosary that you have crafted in secret entirely out of dried, chewed-up breadcrumbs.
It genuinely pushes the boundaries of what we consider human endurance. I mean, we live in an era where we are so accustomed to instantly offloading our thoughts to a cloud server or, an external drive.
Oh, totally. We can't even remember phone numbers anymore.
Right. So the mere idea of your own mind being the sole fragile repository of a highly dangerous historical truth, knowing that if you die, the history of millions of people dies with you, is staggering. The psychological pressure of that is almost impossible to quantify.
Well, that staggering pressure is exactly what we are exploring today. Our sole source for this deep dive is a massive, comprehensive biographical text titled Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Witness to the Century.
And it is a dense, incredible source.
It really is. The mission of this deep dive today is to dissect the extraordinary, almost unbelievable life of a man who survived essentially everything the 20th century could weaponize against a single human being.
Yeah, he really ran the gauntlet.
He did. We are talking about frontline artillery fire, terminal cancer, the absolute darkest depths of the Gulag system, and the full, terrifying, coordinated wrath of the Soviet state.
And somehow, against all mathematical odds, he emerged from that to become one of the most consequential literary and historical voices of the modern era.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the sheer scale of his life reads like a fictional epic. I mean, he operates as a soldier, a mathematician, a political exile, a novelist, a clandestine historian, and eventually this kind of cultural prophet.
What's fascinating here is the core paradox of his life, which the biography highlights immediately. When we think of famous dissidents, whether in history or modern politics, we tend to imagine people who were born rebels.
Right, the people who were always fighting the power.
Exactly. We picture individuals who always stood outside the system, recognizing its flaws from day one, throwing stones at the walls. But Alexander Solzhenitsyn was absolutely not born a dissident.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he was born a true believer. He genuinely, deeply, and intellectually believed in the very Marxist-Leninist system that would later try to crush him into dust.
Well, to actually comprehend how he eventually dismantled the Soviet narrative on a global scale, we can't just skip to the rebellion part. We have to understand why he bought into the state narrative in the first place, right?
Precisely. You have to look at his beginning.
So he was born in 1918, which is practically ground zero for the collapse of the old Russian world. The Russian Civil War is raging all around him.
And the timing of his birth is critical context here. The old imperial order had collapsed just the year prior, right? With the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917.
So he's born right into the fire.
Literally. By 1918, the country was essentially tearing itself apart in this massive, bloody existential struggle between the Bolshevik Reds and the anti-communist whites.
You have famine, indiscriminate violence.
The forced requisitioning of property, a complete breakdown of civil society. And this chaos touched every single family, obviously. But his family's situation was uniquely precarious.
Precarious and honestly already marked by severe tragedy before he even took his first breath. His father, Isayevich, was a highly decorated World War I artillery officer.
A man who had survived 4 years of brutal, mechanized combat against the German Empire.
Right, and then in this cruel twist of fate, he dies in a hunting accident just months before Alexander is born.
It's just tragically ironic.
It is. Consequently, Solzhenitsyn is raised entirely by his widowed mother, Taisia, down in the southern city of Rostov-on-Don.
And Taisia's background provides the first real tension in his life. Her family, the Sherbaks, had been relatively prosperous agricultural landowners before the revolution.
Which used to be a good thing.
Right? In the Tsarist era, that meant comfort and status. But in the new Soviet order, that prosperity was a literal curse. The Bolshevik ideology branded families like hers as class aliens, or kulaks, basically, enemies of the proletariat.
Oh, wow. So she's instantly a target.
Exactly. So you have this highly educated woman, fluent in French, accustomed to a certain standard of living, who suddenly finds herself raising a fatherless son in genuine grinding poverty.
Because the revolution had essentially wiped out everything they had.
Yeah, she was forced to work these menial jobs like a typist and stenographer just to keep the two of them from starving to death. And she had to do all of this while desperately hiding her bourgeois origins from the secret police.
But yet, despite that daily terror and poverty, she refuses to let his mind stagnate. She instills this intense, uncompromising intellectual rigor in him.
And spiritual rigor, too. I mean, the state is pushing aggressive, mandatory atheist propaganda in every school and public square.
But behind closed doors?
Behind closed doors, she quietly raises him in the Russian Orthodox faith. It was a massive risk.
And intellectually, he develops into a total prodigy. By his early teens, he is devouring Tolstoy and literally dreaming of writing the great definitive novel about the Russian Revolution.
He had huge ambitions very early on.
He did, but here is the fascinating pivot. Because they are so desperately poor, he knows literature isn't going to put food on the table. He needs a practical, state-sanctioned career. So he enrolls at Rostov State University, but he doesn't study literature.
No, he studies mathematics and physics.
Which just seems so disconnected from being a novelist.
It does, but that dual passion, the artistic and the analytical, that becomes the defining architecture of his entire mind. While he's acing complex physics and advanced calculus exams in Rostov, he is simultaneously, almost obsessively, taking correspondence courses in literature from a prestigious institute in Moscow.
I look at that combination and it feels so rare. It's essentially like learning the hyper-precise structural engineering required to build a 90-story skyscraper, but your actual secret plan is to use those exact mathematical skills to outline a novel.
That's a great way to put it.
It's this incredible synthesis of cold, rigorous, objective logic and deep, expressive art.
And that structural engineering analogy is entirely accurate for his life. That mathematical training and rigorous, systematic thought and proofs and variables is exactly what later allowed him to structure his massive historical writings so perfectly.
Because his later work isn't just an emotional outcry.
No, not at all. It is structurally impenetrable. It's architectural. But returning to his university years, this is also when he marries his first wife, Natalia. And it's during this period that we see the true believer mindset cement itself completely.
Right, because like many idealistic young Soviets of his generation who had been marinating in state education their whole lives, he fully embraced Marxism-Leninism.
He really did. He looked at Stalin's state and believed, despite the poverty he grew up in, that they were genuinely building a just utopian society.
Which honestly makes me want to pause and challenge that premise for a second. We were talking about a guy whose mother had to hide her background so they wouldn't be thrown in a gulag, who grew up starving because of Bolshevik policies.
Yeah, it seems contradictory.
Extremely. How does a mind that brilliant, reading Tolstoy and studying advanced physics, look at the purges of the 1930s and say, yes, this is a just society? How does the math add up for him?
It is a vital question, and I think it speaks to the intoxicating power of ideological capture. You have to remember that to a fatherless boy raised in poverty, the state offered a grand cosmic narrative.
A sense of belonging, maybe?
Belonging and certainty. Marxism presented itself as a scientific certainty, the inevitable march of history toward human perfection. Solzhenitsyn, with his analytical mind, was drawn to the systemic logic of Marxism.
So how did he justify the violence, the purges?
He rationalized the brutality of the 1930s the same way a lot of intellectuals did back then. He saw it as the necessary tragic friction of transitioning from a feudal society to a utopia. You know, you cannot make an omelet without breaking eggs, as the grim Soviet joke went.
Ah, okay. So he viewed the violence as just a temporary variable in an otherwise perfect equation?
Precisely. And establishing that loyalist baseline is the crucial lens for interpreting his entire life. His later critique of the USSR was not the attack of an ideological enemy who had always hated communism from the outside.
It was an inside job, emotionally speaking.
Exactly. It was the shattering, devastating heartbreak of a true believer. He was a patriot who discovered the system's crimes from the inside. The betrayal he eventually felt was infinitely deeper, precisely because he had freely given the system his absolute unblinking faith.
Wow. And that supreme faith carries him right into 1941, which brings the catastrophic German invasion of the Soviet Union. And here, Solzhenitsyn's mathematical precision directly translates into military success.
He gets commissioned as a Red Army artillery officer.
And he isn't just firing cannons blindly, right? He is commanding a sound-ranging battery, utilizing a technique called acoustic triangulation.
Which is a fascinating, highly technical tactical application. During the war, artillery was the deadliest force on the battlefield, but the guns were often hidden miles behind enemy lines.
So you can't just see them and shoot back.
Right. So Solzhenitsyn's unit would set up a spread of synchronized listening posts. When a German gun fired, the sound wave would hit the different posts at slightly different milliseconds.
Oh, that is wild.
Yeah, and by timing those acoustic waves with stopwatches and using complex trigonometry, Solzhenitsyn could calculate the exact coordinates of the hidden German artillery and direct Soviet counter-battery fire to destroy it.
That's
It
incredible.
was incredibly dangerous forward-line work, and it was a perfect lethal application of his math background.
And he excels at it. He is decorated twice for bravery, receiving the Order of the Red Star and the Order of the Patriotic War. He is promoted to the rank of captain. I mean, he is the model Soviet officer.
It's the fast track.
But as the war progresses into 1945 and the Red Army pushes out of Russia and into East Prussia, which is German territory, his intellectual curiosity, that other side of his brain, begins to process data that completely breaks his ideological equation.
The entry into East Prussia was a massive psychological breaking point for him.
What happened there?
Well, the Soviet forces, fueled by years of unimaginable suffering and state propaganda demanding vengeance, just unleashed horrifying atrocities. Solzhenitsyn witnessed mass, systemic looting, the widespread rape of German women, and indiscriminate violence against unarmed civilians.
That must have been completely jarring for someone who thought he was fighting for a utopia.
It utterly shook his moral foundation. For the first time, he is seeing a massive, unbridgeable disconnect between the utopian, liberating ideals he believed the Red Army represented and the brutal, barbaric reality of the state apparatus he is actually fighting for.
So his brain starts trying to solve this moral discrepancy. He starts writing letters to a childhood friend of his, Nikolai Vitkovich, who is also serving as an officer on a different front.
And in these letters, they are not just catching up, they engage in deep political philosophy.
Right, they are critiquing Stalin, they're using veiled nicknames, referring to him as the boss or the man with the mustache.
And they are essentially arguing that Stalin has corrupted the revolution and that the Soviet Union needs to strip away the bureaucracy and return to true Leninist principles.
But this brings up a massive logical flaw that I really struggle to understand.
Okay.
Well, if Solzhenitsyn is this brilliant mathematician, a man whose entire job is calculating risk and distance and variables, why on earth would he put explicitly treasonous thoughts down in ink, knowing with absolute certainty that military censors read the mail? It seems like a mathematically guaranteed suicide mission.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, looking back with our modern understanding of Stalin's terror, it seems incomprehensibly foolish.
Right.
But if we put ourselves inside the psychology of a loyal Soviet intellectual in 1945, the hubris actually makes sense. Solzhenitsyn did not think he was committing treason.
How could he not?
Because in his mind, treason was collaborating with the Germans. What he was doing, he believed, was intellectually fixing a corrupted revolution. He thought Stalin had deviated from the true Marxist path, and as a loyal, decorated communist who had bled for the country, he felt this arrogant duty to discuss how to course correct.
Oh, so he felt untouchable because he was a loyalist.
Exactly. He had not yet realized the fundamental truth of a totalitarian state. Questioning the supreme leader is treason. The ideology had become completely inseparable from Stalin's personhood.
And the Soviet counterintelligence apparatus, Samur-Aish, which literally translates to death to spies, they do not care about his nuanced arguments for returning to true Leninism.
Not even a little bit. To them, deviation is deviation.
So in February 1945, just months before the war in Europe ends, they intercept the letters, they arrest him right there at his command post on the front lines, they rip the officer's epaulets off his uniform, throw him in a vehicle and ship him all the way back to Moscow, straight into the Lubyanka.
The Lubyanka being the notorious, terrifying headquarters of the Soviet secret police. He is thrown into solitary confinement there and interrogated relentlessly for weeks. He isn't given a defense attorney. He isn't given a public trial. He is quietly convicted by a three-man administrative panel under Article 58.
Ah, Article 58. the infamous statute covering counter-revolutionary activity. We really should pause on Article 58 because it wasn't just a law you broke, it was a social death sentence.
It absolutely was.
Being charged under Article 58 meant you were an enemy of the people. It meant your family could be fired from their jobs, kicked out of their apartments, or arrested themselves simply for knowing you.
Exactly. The psychological weight of Article 58 was designed to completely isolate the victim from society, and his private intercepted letters were all the evidence the tribunal required.
And what was his sentence?
His sentence was handed down as 8 years in the corrective labor camps, to be followed by permanent internal exile.
Which plunges him directly into what the biography frames as the crucible of his memory. This arrest basically drops him out of the world of the living and into the vast shadow world of the Gulag.
A completely different universe.
Yeah, and surviving this underground empire is going to require every single agonizing ounce of both his mathematical logic and his literary soul.
What is particularly horrible, but historically invaluable about his sentence, is that his journey through the penal system was almost entirely panoramic.
What do you mean by panoramic?
Well, he didn't just stay in one camp. He experienced the entire spectrum of Soviet repression. Because of his scientific background in acoustics and mathematics, he was initially spared the absolute worst. He was sent to a sharashka.
Okay, explain the sharashka because the logic of it is deeply twisted to me. The state essentially decides, hey, we have paranoidly arrested all of our top scientists and engineers, but we still really need them to invent weapons for us.
It is the ultimate pragmatic hypocrisy of a totalitarian state. A sharashka was a secret research and development laboratory that operated entirely within the prison system.
Just bizarre.
Very. The inmates were elite intellectuals, physicists, and engineers, and they were treated like prized captive cattle.
So they weren't starving in a forest somewhere.
No, the physical conditions were relatively privileged compared to, say, the logging camps in Siberia. They had adequate caloric intake, clean sheets, and indoor intellectual work. They were tasked with developing espionage tech for the secret police.
Wow.
Solzhenitsyn would later fictionalize this strange, gilded cage in his novel The First Circle. He drew a direct parallel to Dante's outermost circle of hell, where the pagan philosophers reside, spared the physical flames, but permanently denied the presence of God.
But the relative physical safety of the sharashka doesn't last for him, does it?
No, it doesn't. By 1950, he gets into a conflict with the prison authorities. He refuses to cooperate with a specific project, and as punishment, he is stripped of his scientific status and banished from the sharashka. He is thrown right into the absolute abyss.
He is transferred to a special camp in Ekibastos, which is located in the desolate, wind-scoured steppes of Kazakhstan. And this was not a research facility.
Not at all.
This was a camp specifically designed with maximum security, deliberately lethal conditions for Article 58 political prisoners. The reality of Ekibastos is horrifying. He is stripped of his name. He becomes prisoner Shush 262 with the number literally stitched onto his clothes.
Erasing his identity.
Completely. And he is doing brutal manual hard labor. We are talking about bricklaying in freezing winds, working in a foundry breathing toxic dust. He is surviving on starvation-level rations of watery cabbage soup and black bread.
And the demographic of the camp is this intense microcosm of everyone the Soviet state has decided to crush.
Yeah, who else was there with him?
He is sleeping in barracks alongside fierce Ukrainian nationalists, Baltic partisans who fought the Red Army in the forests, Orthodox priests, disgraced intellectuals, and tragically, former Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans during the war and were now being punished by Stalin simply for having survived as POWs.
It's just unconscionable.
It was an environment engineered to strip a man of his humanity and reduce him to an animal fighting for the next scrap of bread. But, remarkably, it was precisely here, in this frozen, starving wasteland, completely denied access to paper or pencils, that Solzhenitsyn begins his true, monumental life's work.
And this brings us back to the breadcrumb rosary, which is, I think, one of the most astonishing mechanisms of survival I have ever heard of in my entire life.
It's incredible.
Walk me through the actual mechanics of this. How do you draft a novel without writing it down?
The mechanism was a brilliant application of his dual mindset. Since being caught with a written manuscript meant severe punishment, he had to build a clandestine architecture entirely within his own brain. He would compose a stanza of poetry or a paragraph of prose while laying bricks. To memorize it, he used immense repetitive mnemonic techniques. But human memory is fallible, right? Especially when you're starving.
Right, your brain is just misfiring from lack of calories.
Exactly. You need a physical anchor to track your progress and ensure you don't drop a sequence. So he took tiny fragments of his bread ration, chewed them up to create a sort of paste, and rolled them into hard, durable beads.
And he hid these.
Yeah, he strung them together, sometimes using a piece of thread unraveled from his uniform, or sometimes just lining them up in his pocket.
Wait, so each bead wasn't a word, right? That would be too many beads. Did it represent a structural block of the text?
Yes, typically one bead represented a specific passage, a stanza, or a structural unit of thought. At a designated time every day, often at night when the barracks were quiet, he would silently pass the beads through his fingers.
Wow.
As he touched bead number 1, he would recite the first stanza in his head. Bead number 2, the second stanza. If he stumbled, he would force himself to repeat it until it was perfect.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. He was essentially formatting his biological memory into an analog hard drive. Like, he partitioned his brain to store evidence, utilizing the physical beads as the directory path.
That's a perfect analogy. He memorized over 12,000 lines of text this way.
It is the ultimate act of defiance. The state could dictate when he woke up, what he ate, how many bricks he laid, and what number he wore, but they could not breach the fortress of his own skull.
They couldn't touch his mind.
But what fascinates me is the content of what he was memorizing. He isn't just archiving his misery, right? He is fundamentally rewriting his entire worldview. The biography points to Ekibastos as the site of his deepest philosophical awakening.
This is the absolute turning point of his intellectual life. Remember, he entered the camp system as a Marxist.
A true believer.
Yes, he still believed, at least partially, in the concept of class struggle, that the wealthy bourgeoisie were inherently corrupt and the working class proletariat were inherently virtuous. But in Ekibastos, that binary ideological framework completely collapsed.
What specifically caused that collapse? Was it just the overall misery of the place?
It was the daily empirical observation of human behavior under extreme duress. He watched how prisoners treated one another.
What did he see?
He saw men of supposedly virtuous proletarian backgrounds, common thieves and workers act with unfathomable cruelty, stealing food from dying men.
Oh, wow.
Conversely, he saw people from the corrupt classes, intellectuals and priests, display incredible self-sacrificial grace, sharing their last rations. He watched the camp guards, who were officially the vanguards of the revolution, behave like sadistic monsters.
So the theory didn't match the reality.
Not at all. This empirical data proved to him that Marxism's foundational premise was a lie. Virtue and vice are not dictated by class.
Which leads to his most famous, piercing realization. He eventually writes this incredible line. The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart.
It is a profound, paradigm-shifting realization. He realized that the capacity for profound cruelty and profound nobility exists equally within every single individual.
Right.
Ideology is merely the rationalization we use to give our inner evil permission to act. Therefore, he concluded, the Soviet system wasn't just a good idea poorly managed by Stalin.
It was rotten at the core.
Exactly. It was structurally, philosophically, and morally evil from its inception, precisely because it denied the concept of individual moral agency and replaced it with class-based determinism.
So he achieves this incredible spiritual clarity, but physically his body is rapidly deteriorating under the strain. In 1952, while he's still doing hard labor in Ekibastos, he is diagnosed with a tumor.
And the medical care there was practically medieval.
Yeah, they operate on him right there in the primitive camp hospital under local anesthesia.
He's agonizing.
But he miraculously survives the surgery. And shortly after, his brutal 8-year sentence concludes in early 1953. In an incredible twist of historical timing, he is released just weeks before Joseph Stalin suffers a stroke and dies.
The timing is unbelievable.
But as we know, surviving the camp didn't mean he got to go home, did it?
No, his original sentence included the caveat of perpetual internal exile. So upon release, he wasn't a free man. He was transported to a remote, dusty settlement called Kokterik in southern Kazakhstan, right near the edge of the desert.
And he couldn't leave.
He was legally forbidden to ever leave the district. To survive, he returned to his pre-war profession, teaching mathematics and physics at the local primary school.
So outwardly, he was just a quiet, unassuming exile.
But internally, he was meticulously writing down the 12,000 lines of text he had stored in his head.
Getting the breadcrumbs onto paper, finally. But the shadow of Ekibastos catches up with him almost immediately. By the end of 1953, the cancer returns, and it comes back with a vengeance. It has metastasized. He is in excruciating pain.
It was a very dark period.
He is granted special permission to travel to a regional cancer clinic in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, for massive doses of radiation therapy. But the reality is, the doctors look at his scans and essentially write him off. They expect him to die within weeks.
It was basically a death sentence.
And yet, against all medical probability, the tumor shrinks. He survives again.
This second survival, this medical miracle, fundamentally and permanently alters his life's trajectory. If Ekibastos broke his Marxism, the cancer ward solidified his new spiritual purpose.
Oh, so.
He experienced a profound religious reawakening. He came to believe with absolute unshakable conviction that his life had not been spared by random biological chance.
He felt chosen.
Yes. He believed God had intervened for a highly specific, singular purpose. He was meant to bear witness. He felt a sacred, terrifying obligation to become the voice for the millions of victims whose voices had been buried in the permafrost.
I want you, the listener, to think about the psychological weight of that conviction. Imagine waking up every day believing that the only reason your cells didn't mutate and kill you is because the universe requires you to write a story that, if discovered, guarantees you a bullet to the back of the head.
It is a burden that would paralyze most people.
Absolutely paralyze them. Instead, he channels it. He uses his experience in Tashkent to begin outlining his novel Cancer Ward.
Which is an absolute masterpiece of political metaphor.
Right, because it's not just about a hospital. No, the Cancer Ward in the novel serves as a macro metaphor for the Soviet state itself. The cancer metastasizing in the bodies of the patients represents the ideological malignancy of totalitarianism in the society.
Wow.
And just as the patients require horrific, agonizing radiation and chemotherapy to survive, Solzhenitsyn was arguing that Russia required a radical, profoundly painful moral intervention to cure its societal sickness.
That is so powerful. So he survives the cancer, Stalin is dead, and in 1956, the new Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, stuns the communist world by giving his famous secret speech where he formally denounces Stalin's cult of personality and his purges.
This initiates a very cautious, highly controlled thaw in the Soviet system.
And because of this political shift, Solzhenitsyn's case is reviewed. In 1957, the state officially rehabilitates him. They declare his original conviction null and void. His record is cleared.
He even remarries his first wife, Natalia, who had divorced him during his imprisonment just to survive.
And they move to Ryazan, a provincial city southeast of Moscow. But he's not living a normal life there. He is living a high-stakes, meticulously calculated double life.
By day, he is the model Soviet citizen. He is a quiet, slightly eccentric, provincial math and astronomy teacher. He rides his bicycle, he follows the syllabus, his students like him.
But the moment he locks his door at night,
he transforms into a secret, one-man archivist of the state's greatest crimes. He is writing ferociously.
And the logistics of his writing process at this time are fascinating. He is operating with the paranoia of a master spy. I mean, he is typing multiple carbon copies of his manuscripts. He is using primitive cameras to microfilm pages. He is literally burying documents in glass jars in people's gardens.
It's pure espionage.
And he is taking his massive, growing manuscript and physically dividing it and trusting different fragments to a tiny, tightly vetted circle of incredibly brave friends who are known as his invisible allies.
To borrow a modern analogy, he was essentially creating an analog blockchain for his literature.
Oh, that's brilliant.
By decentralizing the manuscript, he ensured that if the KGB raided his apartment and arrested him, they would only capture a fragment. The complete ledger of the truth existed in a distributed network across Russia, guaranteeing the work would survive, even if the author did not.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the eruption of truth, because this secret, decentralized cache of writing is about to find a microscopic crack in the Soviet armor, and it happens entirely because of a bizarre fluke of political timing.
Timing is everything.
In 1961, Solzhenitsyn takes an enormous, terrifying, calculated risk. He has written a short, brutally realistic, spare novella about a single day in the life of a labor camp prisoner. It draws heavily on his own time laying bricks in Ekibastos.
He originally titled it Sheet 854, his prisoner number.
But we know it as One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. He decides it is time to test the waters. He submits it to Alexander Twardovsky, the chief editor of Novy Mir, which was the most prestigious literary journal in the Soviet Union.
We really cannot overstate the bravery of Twardovsky in this moment. Twardovsky read the manuscript overnight and instantly recognized two things. First, that he was holding a work of transcendent literary genius on par with Tolstoy.
And second,
that he was holding political dynamite. No one ever had described the labor camps from the inside for a mass domestic audience. It was the ultimate taboo. But Tverdovsky was a shrewd political operator.
What did he do?
He utilized his connections to bypass the standard censorship boards and managed to get the manuscript placed directly on the desk of Nikita Khrushchev himself.
And here's where the story gets surreal. Khrushchev reads it, and he approves it. The premier of the Soviet Union personally authorizes the publication of a book exposing the horrors of the Soviet Gulag in 1962.
It seems impossible.
But it is crucial to understand why. Khrushchev didn't suddenly become a champion of absolute free speech. He was engaged in a vicious power struggle within the Politburo against hardline Stalinists who wanted to oust him. He saw Solzhenitsyn's brutal depiction of Stalin's camps as a political weapon he could wield to discredit his rivals.
Exactly. It was a cynical political maneuver.
Oh, yeah.
Khrushchev authorized its publication in the November 1962 issue of Novy Mir, and the reaction was an absolute tectonic sensation.
Oh, I bet.
The issue sold out nationwide in a matter of hours. People were reading it aloud in factories. They were copying it by hand and passing dog-eared pages from person to person. Literally overnight, this obscure, middle-aged provincial math teacher became the most famous and important writer in the Soviet Union.
So what does this all mean? It is the ultimate backfire for the regime. It is literally like Khrushchev struck a match because he wanted to burn a little bit of political trash in his backyard, and only after he dropped the match did he realize he was standing in the middle of a massive dynamite factory.
That's a great visual.
The state, in attempting to settle an internal political score, accidentally validated and empowered the exact man who was already secretly writing their historical obituary. Because the unintended consequence of publishing Ivan Denisovich was monumental.
It opened a psychological floodgate that the state could not close. Because the book was officially sanctioned, it signaled to millions of traumatized, silent, former Gulag prisoners that they weren't crazy.
It validated them.
It proved that what they had suffered was real, it was acknowledged, and finally it could be spoken about. Almost immediately, Solzhenitsyn was inundated with mail. Hundreds and eventually thousands of letters began pouring into Ryazan from all over the Soviet Union.
He effectively became a lightning rod for the repressed, agonizing grief of an entire nation.
Precisely. And this is where his mission scales up astronomically. These letters weren't just fan mail. They contained deeply guarded secrets, maps of camp layouts, lists of names of executioners, and harrowing personal testimonies of torture and survival.
Oh my.
Solzhenitsyn realized he was being handed the raw, irrefutable data of a genocide. He shifted from being a lone survivor, writing his own autobiographical story, to becoming the chief archivist of a national trauma.
So this became the foundation for his biggest work.
Yes, this massive influx of secret testimony became the foundational source material for his magnum opus, the Gulag Archipelago. He was no longer relying just on his memory. He was cross-referencing the detailed testimonies of 227 individual witnesses. He was applying his rigorous mathematical training to structurally map a historical atrocity.
But the window of tolerance closes violently and fast. In October 1964, Khrushchev is ousted from power in a palace coup. Leonid Brezhnev takes control, and the new regime decides that talking about the state's past crimes is highly destabilizing to the party's authority.
The thaw instantly freezes over.
Solzhenitsyn's major novels, like Cancer Ward and The First Circle, are blocked from publication. The KGB ramps up surveillance. They bug his apartment. They begin raiding the homes of his invisible allies, seizing his papers.
It got incredibly dangerous again.
In 1969, the state officially expels him from the Soviet Writers' Union, which essentially strips him of his legal right to work as a writer and removes any lingering political protection he had.
The state was desperately trying to shove the genie back into the bottle through intimidation, but Solzhenitsyn, always thinking several moves ahead, was already executing his contingency plans.
He knew they were coming.
He knew the KGB was tightening the noose, so he accelerated the process of smuggling his microfilm manuscripts out to the West, using foreign diplomats and sympathetic journalists as couriers. He was establishing his insurance policy. If the KGB assassinated him, the work would still be published globally.
This escalates into a period of terrifying, direct confrontation between one man and a superpower. In 1970, the Swedish Academy announces that Alexander Solzhenitsyn has won the Nobel Prize in Literature.
A massive global recognition.
But he refuses to travel to Stockholm to accept it in person. He correctly calculates that if he leaves the Soviet Union, the regime will revoke his citizenship while he is in the air, lock the door behind him, and never let him return to his homeland, exactly as they did to Boris Pasternak. So he stays in Russia and sends a written lecture instead.
The Soviet state was absolutely infuriated by the Nobel Prize. They viewed it as a hostile Western provocation. They launched a massive vitriolic propaganda campaign across state media, branding him a traitor and a slanderer.
And when that didn't shut him up,
When the propaganda failed to break him, the KGB escalated from harassment to violence. In August 1971, while he was visiting the city of Novocherkassk, the KGB attempted to assassinate him.
and it wasn't a bullet, right? It was a highly sophisticated biological attack.
Yes, there is substantial historical evidence the KGB operatives managed to expose him to a deadly chemical agent, likely ricin, in a covert contact poisoning, similar to the infamous umbrella poisonings they used against other dissidents.
That is terrifying.
Solzhenitsyn fell violently ill. His skin erupted in massive blisters. He suffered agonizing pain and nearly died. But, defying all biological logic yet again, his constitution held out. He survived.
A man just refuses to die. The state throws artillery, cancer, starvation, and literal biological weapons at him, and he keeps writing. But the real tragedy, the heartbreaking catalyst that ultimately forces his hand and triggers the climax of this war, happens in August 1973.
Such a sad story.
It involves a woman named Elizaveta Voronyanskaya. She was one of his most loyal, trusted typists, one of the key nodes in his clandestine network.
The KGB finally tracks her down. They arrest her and take her in for interrogation. She was an older woman, entirely unequipped for the sheer terror of the KGB.
What did they do to her?
They interrogate her relentlessly, without sleep, for 5 solid days. Under that severe, unbearable psychological duress, she finally breaks. She reveals the location of a buried, hidden manuscript of the Gulag Archipelago. They immediately dig it up and confiscate it. They release her, but the immense, crushing guilt of having betrayed the secret she swore to protect is so overwhelming that upon returning home, she tragically takes her own life.
It is deeply haunting. It completely highlights the horrifying human collateral damage of a totalitarian regime. It wasn't just Solzhenitsyn taking the risk. Everyone in his orbit was in mortal danger.
The stakes were quite literally life and death for everyone involved.
When Solzhenitsyn receives the news that she is dead, and crucially that the KGB now possesses a copy of the manuscript, he realizes the game of cat and mouse is over. The time for hiding the truth has passed. He sends a coded message to his contacts in Paris, giving the immediate order to publish the Gulag Archipelago in the West.
The publication of that book in December 1973 was a seismic geopolitical event. This raises an important question. How does a piece of literature actually change geopolitics? How does a stack of paper dismantle the ideological foundation of a superpower?
Right, because we have to play devil's advocate for a moment. Western intelligence agencies and intellectuals had heard rumors about the camps for decades. There had been memoirs published before. Why did this specific book change everything?
Because the West often found it convenient to dismiss previous accounts as Cold War propaganda, or they rationalized the camps as isolated, unfortunate excesses of Stalin's paranoia that Khrushchev had supposedly fixed.
But Solzhenitsyn's book proved otherwise.
What Solzhenitsyn delivered was a devastating 3-volume, meticulously cross-referenced experiment in literary investigation. He didn't just tell sad stories. He used the 227 testimonies combined with Soviet legal documents to prove irrefutably that the camps were not an aberration.
They were the plan.
He proved that mass terror was a structural, foundational feature of Lenin's Bolshevism from day one. He traced the architecture of the repression directly back to the ideological roots of the state. You simply could not dismiss this book as an exaggeration.
The evidence was just too overwhelming.
The sheer weight of the evidence devastated the moral standing of communism on a global scale. It made it intellectually impossible for any academic or politician in the West to sympathetically defend the Soviet project without looking completely morally bankrupt and complicit in mass murder.
The Soviet reaction is frantic and desperate. The book is making international headlines, and Solzhenitsyn is giving interviews to Western journalists right in his Moscow apartment. In February 1974, the Politburo orders his arrest.
They finally pulled the trigger.
They charge him with treason, strip him of his Soviet citizenship, put him on a special plane under heavy guard, and deport him to West Germany. At 55 years old, he is expelled from the only home he has ever known, a homeland he loves deeply despite its government.
Which initiates the next profoundly fascinating chapter of his life, his decades as the highly uncomfortable prophet in the West. If you look at the political dynamics of the Cold War, you would naturally expect that upon arriving in the free world, Solzhenitsyn would embrace his role as a cheering mascot for Western capitalism.
He was the ultimate anti-communist trophy for the West.
Exactly.
But if there's one thing we have learned about him so far, it is that he refuses to be anyone's puppet. He doesn't go on a glamorous speaking tour. Instead, he eventually settles in a heavily guarded, fenced compound in the remote woods of Cavendish, Vermont.
Very isolated.
He completely isolates himself from American culture. He works with absolute monastic discipline on the Red Wheel, which is his massive multi-volume historical cycle, attempting to trace the exact moments where Russia went wrong during the 1917 revolution.
And he stays largely silent for years.
Until 1978, when he is invited to give the commencement address at Harvard University. The speech is titled, "A World Split Apart," and he absolutely shocks the American audience to its core.
He turned his unsparing, laser-focused moral lens right back onto his rescuers. He stood at the podium of one of the most elite institutions in the West, and he delivered a searing critique of Western society.
What did he say?
He accused the West of spiritual exhaustion, rampant materialism, and a cowardly reliance on excessive legalism over genuine moral fortitude. He argued that the West had lost its civic courage and had become culturally superficial.
I think it's really important for us to pause here and state clearly we are just objectively reporting his views based on the source material. We are not endorsing or condemning his critique of the West or his traditionalist perspectives.
Exactly, we are just conveying his worldview as presented in the biography.
But it's fascinating to analyze that Harvard address objectively because whether you personally align with his views or fundamentally disagree with them, you have to appreciate the sheer, unapologetic audacity of the moment. He revealed clearly that he was not, and had never been, a Western liberal Democrat.
No, he was an Orthodox Christian and a deeply traditional Russian nationalist.
He essentially stood there and declared that both geopolitical systems, the communist East and the capitalist West, had fatally lost sight of the transcendent moral order of human existence.
It is an incredible piece of cultural whiplash. The American establishment essentially threw this massive, prestigious party, expecting a grateful anti-communist refugee to get up on stage and validate their way of life.
And
Instead, they got an uncompromising Old Testament prophet pointing a stern finger at them, telling them they were morally bankrupt, just in a different, more comfortable way than the Soviets.
how did his experience in the Gulag specifically inform that critique of the West? Like, why did he view American comfort as a negative?
It circles back directly to his spiritual awakening in Ekabastus. Solzhenitsyn genuinely believed that the intense, unfathomable suffering in the labor camps had forged a profound spiritual depth and moral clarity within the Russian soul.
Suffering as a crucible.
Exactly. He felt that by being forced to confront absolute evil and mortality daily, the prisoners understood what truly mattered. Conversely, he looked at the West and saw a society where material comfort, endless entertainment, and a lack of true hardship had simply eroded away the spiritual core of the people.
It's a heavy critique.
His critique was deeply rooted in a pre-modern religious identity that was incredibly difficult for secular postmodern Western audiences to digest or appreciate.
So he essentially retreats back behind the fences of his Vermont compound, and he just keeps working for 2 decades. Until history, once again, shifts entirely on its axis. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. The empire that tried to erase him simply ceases to exist while he is still sitting at his desk in America.
That's an incredible victory.
His Soviet citizenship is officially restored, and in 1994, he finally makes his long-awaited return to Russia.
But returning home meant facing a newly democratized Russia that he found just as chaotic and disorienting as he found the West.
How so?
Well, he was deeply intentional about how he re-entered the country. He didn't just fly into a VIP reception in Moscow. He flew into Magadan, a city in the Russian Far East that was historically the brutal epicenter and transit hub of the Gulag system.
Oh.
From there, he took a train journey all the way across the vast expanse of Russia. He wanted to look out the window, stop in small towns, and hear directly from ordinary working-class people about what the new Russia looked like.
And he was entirely disgusted by what he saw, wasn't he?
Very much so. The 1990s in Russia under President Boris Yeltsin were defined by chaotic, unregulated privatization. Solzhenitsyn looked around and saw former communist apparatchiks instantly transforming into billionaire oligarchs, stripping the country's assets, while millions of ordinary citizens lost their pensions and were plunged back into the exact kind of poverty his mother had faced.
So the players changed, but the suffering stayed the same.
Exactly. He was so intensely critical of Yeltsin's administration that when Yeltsin attempted to present him with the Order of St. Andrew, the highest state award, in 1998, Solzhenitsyn flat out publicly refused to accept it from a government he felt was destroying the nation.
He remained an absolutely unbending moral force. Now, his relationship with Vladimir Putin, who assumed power after Yeltsin, was slightly warmer, though he fiercely maintained his intellectual independence.
Yes. Solzhenitsyn appreciated Putin's early efforts to restore a sense of state authority, national pride, and stability after the traumatic chaos of the 1990s.
Yeah.
In 2007, he did accept a state prize from Putin.
But he didn't just become a yes man.
Not at all. He never acted as a rubber stamp for the regime. Until his dying day, he continued to publicly demand full historical truth about the Soviet past, moral renewal based on orthodox principles, and crucially, the development of robust, localized grassroots self-government, which he felt was the only way to prevent future tyranny.
And he was writing right up to the very end. In his final years, he published a deeply controversial, massive 2-volume historical work titled 200 Years Together, which attempted to analyze the incredibly complex history of Russian-Jewish relations.
And again, it is vital to note, and we are neutrally reporting this, that this specific work remains a subject of intense historical and cultural dispute.
Yeah.
The biography outlines that the book drew fierce, polarized debate globally. Many critics and historians accuse the work of relying on outdated tropes and bordering on or crossing into anti-Semitism in its analysis of the revolution. Conversely, others defended it as a serious, albeit flawed, attempt to grapple honestly with a painful shared history.
Regardless of where one stands on that specific controversy or his views on Ukrainian independence, it underscores the reality that his later years were incredibly complex and entirely defined by his uncompromising, often polarizing perspective.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the end of his life. Solzhenitsyn passes away in August 2008 from heart failure. He is 89 years old. He is buried, fittingly, at the Donskoy Monastery in Moscow. When you step back and look at the sheer cinematic arc of this life, it is staggering.
It really is.
We are tracing the journey of a fatherless boy starving in the ruins of the Tsar's empire, who becomes a frontline officer, who is thrown into the freezing death camps of Kazakhstan, who survives terminal cancer, who hides manuscripts in jars, who takes down the moral foundation of a superpower, who lives as an exile in the Vermont woods, outlives the entire Soviet apparatus, and finally dies in an Orthodox monastery, living just long enough to see the books that once carried a death sentence become mandatory reading in Russian high schools.
If we were to summarize his ultimate historical and cultural legacy, it is exactly as you described. He wasn't a saint, and he actively resisted being turned into an idol.
He wasn't easy to like.
No, he wasn't an easy, compliant political ally for anyone. Not for the Marxist Soviets, not for the liberal West, and not even for the politicians of both Soviet Russia. He was, at his core, a man who utilized a ferocious, unbending moral certainty, forged in unimaginable suffering, to force the entire world to look at a dark, bloody reality it desperately wanted to ignore.
So, after this massive journey, why does Alexander Solzhenitsyn's life matter to you today? Why should we care in the 21st century? Because his life provides empirical proof that human memory, coupled with individual moral courage, can actually dismantle entrenched state-sponsored falsehoods.
The pen really is mightier than the sword.
Or in his specific case, the chewed-up piece of breadcrumb is mightier than the sword. His entire life is a lived testament to the profound truth of the phrase he used in his Nobel lecture. One word of truth outweighs the whole world.
And he proved it by bringing down a seemingly invincible totalitarian narrative, using nothing but the meticulously preserved memories of the very people the state tried to systematically destroy.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought I want you to mull over as we conclude. Solzhenitsyn survived, and his truth survived, because he used mathematical rigor to build an analog encryption network.
A physical network.
Right. He memorized fast texts with breadcrumbs. He microfilmed pages in secret. He segmented his knowledge across a decentralized network of trusted friends so that no one person, not even the KGB, could capture the whole manuscript at once. Now look at our modern era.
It's a very different landscape.
We live in a society where we voluntarily, enthusiastically broadcast our every waking thought. We rely entirely on centralized digital systems, cloud servers, and corporate platforms that we fundamentally do not control. How vulnerable have we made our own truth?
That's a scary thought.
If the ultimate weapon against totalitarianism is the preservation of unalterable, independent human memory, Do we still have the capacity or the mental fortitude to protect our breadcrumbs if the digital lights ever go out?
That is a deeply haunting question for the digital age, and a perfect place to leave it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive. Take care of yourselves, guard your memories, and we will see you next time.